For more on this development and the 2023 supplementary budget, I'm joined by CEO Economic Associates, Dr. Ayo Teriba. Thank you for joining us on the program this evening. A good place to start, Dr. Teriba, is the Presidential Yacht. Just how convincing would you say the presidency's clarification is for you as an economist?
You are not very audible.
Oh, I was asking if the clarification from the presidency as regards the 5 billion naira earlier allocated for a presidential yacht makes sense to you as an economist.
Oh, well, it makes sense to me because I have looked at the breakdown, of the supplementary budget, and I found indeed that this 5 billion was listed under the capital outlay, capital proposals for the Navy, who submitted, a total of 62 billion. The State House proposal didn't include the presidential yacht. So the presidential spokesman's explanation makes sense. It says, that this is not something that was requested by the State House for use of the president. It's just a nomenclature employed, by the Navy to describe that type of water transportation equipment. And I noticed that even the police, had a similar amount budgeted for boats, which didn't raise any eyebrow. I think what was raising eyebrow is the nomenclature. It's not as if we're talking of a 2.1 trillion budget, and this is 5 billion naira because the presidential yacht suggested that maybe this is the president wanting to indulge himself in some luxury. So, in addition to the explanation of the presidential spokesman, perhaps the Navy might also want to clear air.
I'm sure as an economist, you agree that the concerns, were rightly shared given the, economic realities of most Nigerians at this time. But what do you make of the decision of the lawmakers to reallocate the fund to increase the students' loan to 10 billion naira?
Right. I mean, I'm glad that not just that Nigerians, had expressed their right and freedom, to express their feelings, but that the powers, at the highest level have also listened, and that, provided an explanation. That is not probably what the majority of the had thought. As to the decision the House of Reps to move the allocation to the students' loan, again, the Constitution gives the powers to the National Assembly, to consider, modify and amend appropriation proposals. They were exhausted. The powers that had constitutionally been given to them.
Indeed, Dr. Teriba, I think we're having challenges connecting with the economist, but we'll keep trying. The 2023 supplementary budget, if you can hear me, Dr. Teriba, yes, as we understand it, is to be channeled towards funding national defense and security, as well as the provision of welfare packages for Nigerians. I think the largest chunk of 600 billion naira is going to security and defense. But there's the question of whether or not a supplementary budget is justified, considering there are already budgets this year for these MDAs. Help us understand why this is needed 2 months to the end of the year.
Well, we have to understand, one, that our budgets are appropriated in Naira. And between June this year and today, what has happened to the Naira. Yeah, we earned some $1 revenue, which when converted means that the revenue available has also increased. The exchange rate that prevails now is much higher than the exchange rates at which the budget had been drawn. So if the budget had been drawn at 400 and something naira to the dollar, revenues are coming in at, higher than that now. And therefore, it makes sense that spending similarly that had been budgeted in naira needs to be marked up, if for no other reason, to reflect the movement in the exchange rate, which the revenue has reflected, and also to perhaps compensate for the fact that global shocks to commodity prices, to energy and food prices, had also meant that inflation, for example, Nigeria's inflation is 25%. So if this is a markup on the original spending proposal, the original spending proposal was about 21 trillion. So this is about 10% markup on it. It seems eminently justifiable considering movements in exchange rate and commodity prices, will be my view. And the new government has come in, had to manage some crises, had to make some welfare commitments that were largely extra budgetary. All these promises to pay workers this amount, promises to pay, the underprivileged, the poor, or the vulnerable.
Exactly.
How budgetary. So it makes sense, that the new government in particular, to be able to keep their promises, to ensure that the populace are protected from the bite, for example, of the devaluation that we have seen, the bite of pump prices of petroleum, might need some more money. And of course, security. Every Nigerian will readily welcome any efforts that the government is making to ensure better defense, better security,
All right,
and more effective policing in the country.
let's take a closer look to the spendings you've just talked about. A sum of 210 billion naira provided for the payment of wage awards based on the negotiation the federal government had with organized labor earlier, close to 400 billion for conditional cash transfer. You recall that we earlier secured a $800 million loan from the World Bank to pay cash transfers. How much impact is this kind of spending expected to have on the economy?
Okay, the two figures you mentioned, sums up to 600 billion. Yeah, you have to think about, when you are talking about impact, it's not just about the fact of the spending. It's about the size and significance of the spending. We are dealing with an economy that is in excess of 200 trillion naira. Should be closer to 250 trillion naira. So 2.1 trillion supplementary spending is less than 1%, if you like, of that GDP. So don't overload expectations on 1% of GDP outlay. The total, spending by the government, for it to have significant effect on the populace, has to rise up to like quarter of the GDP, 25% of the GDP, or far more than that. So while it is good, to put these monies out there to protect the vulnerable, you are looking more like minimizing damage to the economy rather than maximizing multiplier effect. It's too small an amount, to start nursing expectations of big impact, if I may put it that way.
But is it clear how government intends to fund the 2.1 trillion naira supplementary budget? There have been speculations that, perhaps the funds will come from either money saved from subsidies or the recent World Bank loan.
Well, I thought I had a comment somewhere that the DMO has been instructed. I get the feeling, that some of these spending are likely, to be covered by financing. I'm not sure that, of course, by the original budget, revenue was going to be about 11 trillion less than spending. And we're adding 2.1 trillion to that spending. I'm not sure, how much subsidy removal had added to revenue, given that the savings, we were told that for so many months to the end of the Buhari regime, the deficits were actually debt. No remittance, no monies were passed to the NFPC to cover the debt. They were debts. So stopping subsidy means blocking, accrual of debt, not receipt of fresh revenue. Where you clearly have gained more revenue is not from the subsidy removal. It's from the exchange rate, the higher exchange rate than budgeted, at which our dollar receipts are being converted. And I do not know the extent to which that will ensure, that the gap between spending and revenue will be closed such that you need to borrow less. So my suspicion is that the supplementary budget some of it will have to be financed. And it's important, that we debate how it will be financed. It's not likely at any time in the foreseeable future that Nigeria, like most countries, would have enough revenue to cover our expenditure. But how you finance the shortfall, it's the most important conversation that Nigeria has to face now.
There's a lot of optimism from Mr. President's speech some months ago when he mentioned that we'd saved ₦1 trillion, I think, in a month or two from subsidy removal. So when you say there might never be a time where we have the capacity to fund the budget, aren't you quite optimistic that we're saving a lot these days?
Capacity, get me clear, we've been doing deficit financing. And in the foreseeable future, we will remain deficit financed. We will spend more than our revenue. And so it's important to confront the question, how do you want to finance? Rushing to the debt market, given the mountain of debt that we have inherited, 87 trillion by June this year, means that we should slow down on debt issuance. I think enough has been said, even by the coordinating minister of the economy, and it says we can't borrow. We have to look for equity issuance option. So how, when the National Assembly approves additional spending, how they are going to, stop referring the financing to the debt management office is the next challenge. So if you want to seek equity option, where is that institution? So you have a DMO, because you need an equity management office. You don't need a debt management office to raise equity against our assets, to ensure that much of our spending are asset financed. You shouldn't be securitizing income, because you need that income down the road. Okay, so you can't bring tomorrow's income today. You should be securitizing assets.
Right.
So National Assembly and it has to engage us more about the roadmap for ensuring that as we try to finance our deficits, we are going to be doing so through equity or equity equivalent vehicles rather than through debt, which creates more problems, than solutions.
Thing you've talked about is how little all of the supplementary budget is compared to the GDP itself. But the president, in his letter to the lawmakers, emphasized the importance of, implementing additional palliative measures. He talked about including the wage award for public servants and the enhanced cash transfer program as we know it, to support the vulnerable. So based on what you said earlier as to how little this percentage is in the scheme of things, are you also saying that Nigerians shouldn't expect much as to the impact this will have on this aforementioned expectations?
I'm talking about significance. I'm talking about size and significance. Remember, this is a supplementary budget coming up. Today is November 2nd. So this came at the end of October. 2 months to the end of the year. Already, we should be preparing to have conversations around the full budget for next year. You should look more towards the full budget for next year for impact. The appropriation, the supplementary appropriation is more to protect people. So where you load expectations about impact is the full year budget. That's much bigger.
Yes.
26 trillion is more than 10 times.
Indeed.
About 12 times 2.1 trillion.
Indeed, Dr. Seriba.
So that's about 12% of GDP also. So, and that may be...
I get your point precisely, talking about significance and looking forward to how this would impact in the coming days.